The sun had barely risen over the bustling terminal at JFK International Airport as travelers rushed to catch their early morning flights. Among them was a well-dressed man in his mid-40s, rolling a sleek carry-on suitcase while balancing a leather laptop bag on his shoulder. As the CEO of Tech Vision Enterprises, Mr. Chen had mastered the art of efficient travel, having flown countless times for business meetings across the globe. Today's flight to San Francisco wasn't just another business trip, it was perhaps one of the most crucial journeys of his career. In less than 8 hours, he would be presenting Tech Vision's groundbreaking renewable energy initiative to the board of directors, a project that could revolutionize how tech companies approach sustainability. The premium check-in counter was surprisingly empty, and the process was smooth. The attendant smiled warmly, commenting on how refreshing it was to see frequent flyers arrive with plenty of time to spare. Mr. Chen returned the smile, remembering how his grandmother had always taught him that being early was being on time, and being on time was being late. As he made his way through security, he couldn't help but notice the usual mix of reactions he'd grown accustomed to over the years. Some security officers were overly scrutinizing, while others maintained professional indifference. After 20 years in the corporate world, he had developed a thick skin, letting these moments roll off his back like water off a duck's feathers. The first-class lounge was his sanctuary, a quiet space where he could review his presentation one last time. He sipped his green tea, making minor adjustments to the slides while watching planes take off through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The morning light painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, a good omen for what he hoped would be a transformative day. Boarding began right on schedule. Mr. Chen waited patiently in the priority line, boarding pass and ID ready in hand. As he walked down the jet bridge, he mentally prepared himself for the 6-hour flight ahead. His routine was always the same: settle in, review documents for the first hour, then catch up on some much-needed rest. The familiar scent of fresh leather seats and coffee welcomed him as he stepped into the first-class cabin. He located his seat, 2A, and efficiently stored his carry-on in the overhead compartment. A flight attendant, Ms. Reed, was already moving through the cabin, her experienced eyes scanning each passenger with a mix of assessment and judgment that seemed to go beyond standard protocol. When their eyes met, something shifted in her demeanor. Her professional smile faltered slightly, replaced by a look that Mr. Chen knew all too well. It was the same look he'd encountered countless times throughout his career, a mixture of doubt, suspicion, and unwarranted scrutiny. As other passengers filtered into the cabin, Ms. Reed seemed to hover near his seat more than necessary. She watched as he pulled out his laptop, their gaze lingering a bit too long when he adjusted his Rolex watch. A 20th anniversary gift from his wife. The atmosphere grew increasingly uncomfortable as she made several passes by his seat, each time finding a reason to scan the overhead compartment or adjust something nearby. Other first-class passengers were greeted with warm smiles and friendly conversation, but when Ms. Reed approached Mr. Chen with the pre-flight beverage service, her tone was noticeably different. "Your boarding pass, please," she demanded, despite having already checked it during boarding. The request was loud enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. Mr. Chen maintained his composure, reaching for his boarding pass with the practiced patience of someone who had weathered similar storms before. He knew that his response in the next few moments would set the tone for what was about to unfold. As he pulled out his credentials, he could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, some already reaching for their phones, sensing the tension building in the cabin. Little did anyone know that this seemingly routine flight would become a pivotal moment not just for Mr. Chen and Ms. Reed, but for the entire airline industry. The events about to unfold would spark a conversation that needed to happen, leading to changes that would ripple through corporate America. But for now, in that tense moment before takeoff, it was just another example of the subtle battles faced by successful professionals who didn't fit certain people's preconceived notions of what a first-class passenger should look like. The tension in the first-class cabin continued to build as Ms. Reed examined Mr. Chen's boarding pass with exaggerated scrutiny. She held it up to the light, checking and rechecking the seat number as if expecting to find evidence of forgery. Meanwhile, other passengers were settling into their seats, some pretending not to notice the unfolding scene while others openly stared. "Is there a problem?" Mr. Chen asked quietly, his voice steady despite the growing discomfort of the situation. He'd spent years in boardrooms learning to keep his composure under pressure, but this was different. This was personal, and it was happening in front of a cabin full of strangers. "Well," Ms. Reed replied, her voice carrying across the cabin, "it's just that these seats are usually reserved for our premium customers." She emphasized the word premium while giving his tailored suit a dismissive glance, as if suggesting his appearance was somehow deceiving. A businessman across the aisle looked up from his newspaper, frowning at the exchange. 2 rows behind, a young woman had already pulled out her phone, recording the interaction discreetly. The air in the cabin grew thick with tension as other flight attendants bustled past, pretending not to notice the confrontation brewing in first class. Mr. Chen took a deep breath, remembering his mother's words from years ago. "Your reaction to ignorance shows more about your character than their actions show about theirs." He reached into his laptop bag and pulled out his Platinum Airline membership card, his movement deliberate and unhurried. "I fly this route twice a month," he explained calmly. "I've accumulated over 1 million miles with your airline." He placed the membership card next to his boarding pass, the metal card catching the morning light streaming through the window. Ms. Reed's expression flickered for a moment, but she pressed on. "I'll still need to verify this with the gate agent," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "There have been several incidents of seat confusion lately." She emphasized the word confusion while giving Mr. Chen a pointed look. The young woman with the phone was now openly recording, her camera catching every word of the exchange. An elderly gentleman in the row had turned around, his face a mix of concern and disapproval, though it wasn't clear whether his disapproval was directed at Ms. Reed or Mr. Chen. Just then, another flight attendant approached, this one older with a kind face and a nameplate identifying her as the lead flight attendant. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her experienced eyes taking in the scene quickly. "I'm just doing a routine seat verification," Ms. Reed responded, her tone suggesting there was nothing routine about it. "This passenger's documentation seems unusual." The lead flight attendant glanced at Mr. Chen's boarding pass and platinum card, then did a double take as recognition dawned on her face. She had seen his photo just last week in the airline's corporate newsletter. Tech Vision Enterprises, his company, had recently signed a massive contract with the airline, providing cutting-edge software solutions for their entire booking system. Before she could speak, Ms. Reed continued her interrogation. "Sir, if you could just gather your belongings and step into the galley with me, we can sort this out before takeoff." Her tone carried an assumption of guilt that made several passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Mr. Chen remained seated, his posture relaxed but dignified. "I don't believe that will be necessary," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned their position through years of handling difficult situations. "My documentation is in order, and I have a board meeting to prepare for." The mention of a board meeting caused Ms. Reed to scoff visibly, drawing shocked looks from nearby passengers. The young woman with the phone adjusted her position to get a better angle, knowing she was documenting something significant. At this point, the lead flight attendant tried to intervene, having realized the gravity of the situation. "Ms. Reed, could I speak with you for a moment?" she asked, gesturing toward the galley. But Ms. Reed seemed determined to make her point. "If you're really who you claim to be," she said, emphasizing the word really with obvious doubt, "then you wouldn't mind proving it. We have procedures to follow." She crossed her arms, waiting expectantly. The cabin had grown completely silent. Even the usual pre-flight rustling of newspapers and clicking of seatbelts had ceased. Every passenger was now fully invested in the drama unfolding before them, watching to see how this increasingly tense situation would resolve. Mr. Chen slowly reached for his phone, opened his email, and pulled up the airline's corporate newsletter from the previous week. There on the screen was a photo of him shaking hands with the airline's CEO, both smiling as they signed the multi-million-dollar technology contract that would revolutionize the airline's booking system. The lead flight attendant's eyes widened as she saw the image, immediately recognizing the severity of the situation. She gently touched Ms. Reed's elbow, trying once again to guide her toward the galley for a private conversation. But the damage was already done. The video was rolling, the passengers were watching, and what happened next would change not just careers, but an entire corporate culture. The newsletter photo on Mr. Chen's phone screen seemed to freeze time in the first-class cabin. Several passengers leaned forward in their seats, trying to get a better look at the image that was causing such a stir. The young woman who had been recording everything zoomed in on the phone, making sure to capture this pivotal moment. Ms. Reed's face went through a remarkable transformation, from righteous certainty to dawning realization, and finally, to something approaching horror. The newsletter wasn't just any corporate update, it was featuring the largest technology deal in the airline's history. The headline read, "Tech Vision Enterprises and Sky Airlines join forces in groundbreaking partnership." The lead flight attendant cleared her throat softly. "Ms. Reed, we need to speak privately." Now, her tone was gentle but left no room for argument. But before they could move toward the galley, the co-pilot emerged from the cockpit, having been alerted to a potential disturbance in first class. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, his presence adding another layer of gravity to the situation. His eyes swept across the scene, the gathered crowd of onlookers, phones recording, the visibly uncomfortable lead flight attendant, a flustered Ms. Reed, and Mr. Chen, who remained remarkably composed despite it all. Mr. Chen spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of corporate leadership. "There seems to be some confusion about my right to be seated in first class," he explained calmly. "Though I must admit, I'm curious about what sparked such intense scrutiny of my credentials." The co-pilot's eyes widened as he recognized Mr. Chen from recent company briefings. The new booking system, developed by Tech Vision, was set to save the airline millions in operational costs. He had just attended a training session about it last week. "Sir, the co-pilot stumbled over his words, realizing the magnitude of the situation. More passengers had their phones out now, sensing that this moment would soon be making headlines. A distinguished-looking woman in the row behind Mr. Chen spoke up. "I've been flying first class for 15 years, she said, her voice clear and firm. "I've never seen anyone's credentials questioned with such persistence." The way she emphasized the last word made it clear she was being diplomatic. The lead flight attendant tried once again to defuse the situation. "Mr. Chen, on behalf of the airline, I want to express our sincerest." But Mr. Chen raised his hand gently, interrupting the apology. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice carrying the same calm authority he used in board meetings, "I'd like to understand something." He turned to Ms. Reed, who was now visibly pale. "What was it specifically about me that made you question my presence here? What was different about me compared to the other passengers you greeted so warmly?" The question hung in the air like a heady cloud. Every passenger knew exactly what was different, and the uncomfortable silence that followed spoke volumes. Someone coughed nervously. The young woman recording everything adjusted her phone, making sure to capture every second of this moment. Ms. Reed opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her flight manifest. The lead flight attendant placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, but the gesture seemed to make her more uncomfortable rather than less. I was just following procedures," Ms. Reed finally managed, but her voice lacked conviction. "We have to be vigilant about what?" Mr. Chen asked softly, not unkindly. "About successful professionals who don't match your preconceptions. About travelers who look different from what you expect to see in first class." The co-pilot stepped forward, recognizing that this situation needed immediate attention. "Sir, would you be willing to speak with me privately? Perhaps we could discuss this in the galley or the cockpit." But Mr. Chen shook his head slowly. "I believe this conversation needs to happen right here," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent cabin. "Not to shame anyone, but because sometimes the most important lessons need an audience. Sometimes change only happens when we're forced to confront our biases in front of others." He paused, looking around the cabin at the faces of his fellow passengers, many of whom nodded in understanding. "This isn't about punishment," he continued. "It's about growth. It's about making sure that the next person who sits in this seat, regardless of what they look like, is treated with the same respect as everyone else." The young woman who had been recording everything wiped a tear from her eye, though her phone remained steady. The elderly gentleman who had seemed disapproving earlier was now nodding vigorously. Even the businesswoman with the newspaper had set it aside, completely engaged in the unfolding scene. As the tension in the cabin reached its peak, no one knew that this moment would soon become a viral sensation, a teaching tool, and ultimately, a catalyst for change throughout the entire airline industry. But right then, in that pressurized cabin at Gate 23B, all anyone could feel was the weight of truth being spoken plainly and the unmistakable sense that they were witnessing something important. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted as the lead flight attendant stepped forward, holding her tablet with trembling hands. On the screen was not just the corporate newsletter, but a full company-wide memo about TechVision's revolutionary partnership with the airline. The memo detailed how this collaboration would transform everything from booking processes to customer experience, complete with Mr. Chen's professional headshot and his impressive biography. Our airline is about to implement a $50 million booking system designed by TechVision, she explained, her voice carrying across the hushed cabin. Mr. Chen's company has been featured in every major business magazine this month. They're changing how the entire airline industry operates. The color drained completely from Ms. Reed's face as the reality of her actions sank in. She wasn't just confronting any passenger, she was questioning the CEO of a company that was now intrinsically linked to the airline's future. The young woman who had been recording everything let out a small gasp, and several other passengers exchanged meaningful looks. The business traveler across the aisle quietly folded his newspaper and leaned forward. "I thought you looked familiar," he said to Mr. Chen. "My company just switched to TechVision's cloud services last month. The efficiency improvements have been remarkable." More passengers began to recognize Mr. Chen, making connections to news stories they'd read or projects their own companies had undertaken with TechVision. The first-class cabin buzzed with whispered conversations as people shared their knowledge of his accomplishments. Last year's Innovation Award, the Renewable Energy Initiative, that incredible speech at the Tech Summit. Ms. Reed stood rooted to the spot, her airline manual clutched to her chest like a shield. The lead flight attendant gently guided her toward the galley, but Mr. Chen spoke up again. "Please wait," he said softly. "There's something important we need to address." He turned to face Ms. Reed directly. "I'm curious, did you know that TechVision employs over 5,000 people from 47 different countries? That we have offices in 6 continents? That our leadership team represents 12 different nationalities?" Ms. Reed shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "When I started my career," Mr. Chen continued, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone, "I was often the only person who looked like me in most business meetings. I've been stopped by security in my own office building. I've been asked to serve coffee during board meetings where I was actually the chairman." The cabin had grown so quiet you could hear the distant sound of luggage being loaded into the cargo hold below. Every passenger was fully invested in his words. "But here's what's interesting," he went on, looking around at his fellow passengers. "Every single time something like this happened, I had a choice. I could react with anger, which would only reinforce certain stereotypes, or I could use it as a teaching moment, a chance to help someone expand their worldview." The young woman who had been recording lowered her phone slightly, wiped her eyes, then raised it again, determined not to miss a moment. "Your airline," Mr. Chen addressed Ms. Reed directly but kindly, "is about to implement technology that will connect people from every corner of the world. It will help millions of travelers reach their destinations, regardless of their background, appearance, or social status." The irony of this situation isn't lost on me. A flight attendant from economy class, drawn by the unusual quiet in first class, peeked through the curtain. Seeing the gathered crowd and sensing the importance of the moment, she quickly retreated, but not before hearing Mr. Chen's next words. "Success doesn't look like any one thing," he said, gesturing to the diverse group of passengers in first class. "Leadership doesn't have a specific appearance. Excellence comes in every color, every accent, every background imaginable." The elderly gentleman who had been watching everything unfold suddenly spoke up. "When I started flying in the 1970s, he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "I never thought I'd see such diversity in first class. Times have changed, and thank goodness for that." The co-pilot, who had been standing quietly near the cockpit door, stepped forward again. "Sir," he addressed Mr. Chen, "I believe our CEO would very much like to speak with you before takeoff. Would you be willing to take a call?" But Mr. Chen shook his head. "First, I think Ms. Reed, and I need to have a conversation about moving forward. Not about punishment, but about growth. About how we can turn this moment into something meaningful for everyone involved." As those words settled over the cabin, phones still recording and passengers still watching intently, no one realized they were witnessing what would soon become a viral moment, one that would spark a national conversation about bias, leadership, and the power of choosing education over retaliation. The airline's ground crew had already closed the aircraft door when Mr. Chen suggested something unexpected. He asked the lead flight attendant if they could use the small office near the gate for a brief conversation before takeoff. Looking at his watch, he noted they still had 20 minutes before their scheduled departure time. The co-pilot quickly made arrangements through the control tower for a slight delay, explaining it as a customer relations matter requiring immediate attention. As passengers watched through the windows, Mr. Chen, Ms. Reed, and the lead flight attendant made their way back into the terminal. In the small office, with its view of the bustling tarmac, Ms. Reed sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face showed a mix of fear and shame, fear for her job and shame for her actions. The lead flight attendant stood by the door, unsure of what was about to unfold. "Before we begin," Mr. Chen said, settling into a chair across from Ms. Reed, "I want you to know that I'm not here to get you fired." The tension in Ms. Reed's shoulders visibly decreased, though her hands remained tightly clasped. "I've been in aviation for 18 years, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think She stopped, taking a shaky breath. "Let me share something with you," Mr. Chen said, pulling out his phone again. This time, he showed a different photo, a much older one. It showed a young man in a shabby suit, standing in front of a small computer repair shop. "This was me 20 years ago. I had just started my business in a tiny storefront. My first client canceled their contract because they didn't believe I looked like a tech expert." The lead flight attendant moved closer, interested in the story. Ms. Reed looked up from her hands for the first time, her eyes focusing on the old photograph. "That moment could have broken me," Mr. Chen continued. "Instead, it drove me to prove that expertise and ability have nothing to do with appearance. Today, I want to offer you a similar opportunity for growth." He pulled up his laptop and opened a presentation he'd been working on for the board meeting. "This is our new booking system, the one your airline is implementing. It's designed to make travel more accessible and comfortable for everyone. But technology is only part of the solution. The human element, how we treat each other, that's equally important." Ms. Reed wiped her eyes with a tissue offered by the lead flight attendant. "I don't know how to make this right," she admitted. "Those passengers, their phones, my career is probably over." Mr. Chen shook his head. "Actually, I have a different idea. Those recordings, they could become part of something bigger, something meaningful." He turned to the lead flight attendant. "Your airline's training program, does it include real-world scenarios about unconscious bias?" The lead flight attendant shook her head. "We have basic diversity training, but nothing really comprehensive." "Then let's change that," Mr. Chen said, his eyes lighting up with the same enthusiasm he showed when developing new technology. "Ms. Reed, would you be willing to share your story? To help other airline staff learn from this experience?" Ms. Reed looked startled. "You want me to talk about what I did wrong?" "I want you to talk about what you learned," Mr. Chen corrected gently. "About how this moment changed your perspective. Real change doesn't come from hiding our mistakes. It comes from acknowledging them and helping others avoid the same ones." The lead flight attendant stepped forward. "This could be incredibly powerful," she said, "especially coming from someone with your experience, someone other flight attendants respect." Outside the office window, the morning sun had fully risen, casting a warm glow across the tarmac. Ground crews moved between planes. A reminder that the world of aviation never stopped moving, never stopped connecting people from all walks of life. "I don't deserve this chance," Ms. Reed said quietly, but with a hint of hope in her voice. "It's not about deserving," Mr. Chen replied. "It's about choosing to be part of the solution. When I started Tech Vision, I promised myself that any success I achieved would be used to open doors for others. This is one of those doors." He checked his watch again. "We have a plane full of passengers waiting, and I have a board meeting to get to." but I think this delay might end up being the most productive 15 minutes of my entire trip. The lead flight attendant's phone buzzed, a message from the cockpit asking about their status. As they prepared to return to the aircraft, Mr. Chen had one more thing to say. "You know," he said, looking at Ms. Reed, "the best leaders aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who learn from them and help others avoid the same pitfalls. Are you ready to become that kind of leader?" As they walked back to the plane, something had shifted. The viral video that would soon sweep across social media wouldn't just be about bias and confrontation. It would be about transformation, about choosing education over punishment, about turning an uncomfortable moment into an opportunity for widespread change. 3 weeks after the incident, the airline's corporate headquarters was buzzing with activity. The training room on the 15th floor was packed with flight attendants, ground crew, and customer service representatives. At the front of the room stood Mr. Chen and Ms. Reed, an unlikely pair brought together by circumstance and transformed by choice. The viral video of their confrontation had indeed spread across social media, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of calls for firing or public shaming, the conversation had shifted towards something more constructive. Mr. Chen's handling of the situation had sparked a nationwide dialogue about addressing bias in customer service. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Ms. Reed began, her voice stronger than it had been that day on the plane. "But sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth." The room was silent, every person leaning in to hear her story. Behind her, a screen showed clips from that morning, not just the confrontation, but the resolution that followed. The airline had made the bold decision to incorporate the entire incident into their new training program, with both Mr. Chen and Ms. Reed's full cooperation. Looking back, Ms. Reed continued, "I can see all the little assumptions I made that morning. Each tiny judgment that led to a bigger mistake." She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about unconscious bias in customer service across various industries. Mr. Chen stepped forward. "What makes this program unique is its honesty," he explained. "We're not here to pretend these situations don't happen. We're here to face them head-on and learn from them." His company, TechVision, had partnered with the airline to develop not just their booking system, but now also their corporate training materials. The presentation moved on to real-world scenarios, each one drawn from actual experiences. Flight attendants in the audience nodded in recognition at some situations, shifted uncomfortably at others. This wasn't the usual corporate training video. This was raw, real, and relatable. "The hardest part," Ms. Reed shared, "wasn't facing my mistake. It was realizing how many times I might have made similar assumptions without even knowing it." Several heads in the audience nodded, understanding the weight of her words. A flight attendant raised her hand. "But how do we handle suspicious behavior without appearing biased?" It was the question everyone had been thinking about. Mr. Chen smiled. "That's exactly the right question," he said. "Let's break down the difference between actual suspicious behavior and assumptions based on appearance." He clicked to a new slide showing clear, objective criteria for security concerns. The training session continued with interactive exercises. Attendees role-played various scenarios, learning to recognize and challenge their own unconscious biases. The energy in the room was different from typical corporate training. People were engaged, asking questions, sharing their own experiences. During the lunch break, the airline's CEO made a surprise appearance. "What started as a potentially disastrous incident has become a turning point for our company," they announced. Other airlines have already reached out, asking to implement similar training programs. The afternoon session focused on practical solutions. Mr. Chen shared stories from his years of business travel, while Ms. Reed offered insights from her extensive experience in aviation. Together, they helped the audience understand both sides of every interaction. "The key," Mr. Chen explained, "is to remember that every passenger has a story. Every person who steps onto that plane is someone's family member, someone's colleague, someone's friend. They might be heading to a business meeting, a wedding, or a funeral. Our job is to see the human being, not our assumptions about them." Ms. Reed added her perspective. "I used to think being professional meant being suspicious. Now I understand that true professionalism means being fair, being open, and being willing to learn from our mistakes." As the training session wrapped up, Participants were given special pins, a simple design showing two hands clasped together. "These aren't just accessories," the airline's CEO explained. "They're reminders of our commitment to treating every passenger with dignity and respect." The impact of this new training program stretched far beyond that one room. Other companies began reaching out, asking how they could implement similar initiatives. The video that could have ended a career instead launched a movement toward more thoughtful, inclusive customer service. At the end of the day, Mr. Chen and Ms. Reed stood by the window, looking out at planes taking off and landing. "Did you ever imagine," she asked, "that your boarding pass check would lead to all this?" He smiled, watching another plane soar into the clouds. "Sometimes the best changes come from the hardest moments," he replied. "The key is being willing to learn and grow from them." Below them, in the terminal, thousands of travelers moved through their days, each carrying their own stories, their own dreams, their own destinations. And thanks to one difficult morning and the choices that followed, more of them would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning flight, and the main conference hall of the International Aviation Summit was packed to capacity. Industry leaders from around the world had gathered to discuss the future of air travel, but today's most anticipated session wasn't about new aircraft technology or fuel efficiency, it was about human connection. Mr. Chen stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces before him. In the front row sat Ms. Reed, now wearing a badge that identified her as the airline's head of customer experience training. The journey that had brought them both to this moment was something neither could have imagined half a year ago. "When I boarded that flight 6 months ago," Mr. Chen began, his voice carrying across the silent hall, "I was prepared to present a new booking system to my board of directors. Instead, life had different plans for me that day." The screen behind him showed clips from the viral video that had now been viewed over 50 million times. "But this isn't just a story about one incident," he continued. "It's about what happens when we choose to transform difficult moments into opportunities for change." He clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from the airline's new training program. The numbers were impressive. Customer complaints related to bias had dropped by 78%. Employee satisfaction scores had increased by 45%. The airline's social media sentiment had improved by 92%. But the most striking figure was this. Over 400 other companies had requested information about implementing similar training programs. Ms. Reed took the stage next, her confidence a stark contrast to the uncertain flight attendant from 6 months ago. "Every day, millions of people board planes," she said. "Each of them carries not just luggage, but hopes, dreams, and stories. Our job isn't just to get them safely to their destination, it's to make them feel valued along the way." The presentation continued with video testimonials from other flight attendants and passengers. One clip showed the young woman who had recorded the original incident, now working as a social media consultant for the airline's diversity initiatives. The elderly gentleman from the flight appeared too, sharing how the incident had reminded him of his own experiences with prejudice decades ago. "The real breakthrough," Mr. Chen explained, "came when we stopped treating bias as something to avoid talking about and started seeing it as something to address openly and honestly." He showed slides of the interactive training modules that Tech Vision had developed, now being used by airlines and service industries worldwide. A flight attendant from a different airline raised her hand during the Q&A session. "How do you handle the fear of making mistakes?" she asked. "Sometimes we're so worried about appearing biased that we don't know how to act at all." As the audience rose for a standing ovation, cameras flashed throughout the hall. Industry publications would later call this presentation a turning point in aviation customer service. But for Mr. Chen and Ms. Reed, standing there on that stage, it was something more personal, proof that even our hardest moments can lead to our greatest impact. The summit's organizer stepped up to make an announcement. The airline's training program had just been awarded the Industry Innovation Award for its revolutionary approach to customer service. As Mr. Chen and Ms. Reed accepted the award together, the message was clear. Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our most important contributions if we're brave enough to learn from them and honest enough to share those lessons with others. Outside the conference hall, planes continued to take off and land, carrying thousands of passengers to their destinations. But now, thanks to one difficult morning and the choices that followed, each of those journeys had a better chance of being marked by understanding, respect, and the simple dignity that every traveler deserves.